33% only of the people they polled approving of what he's done so far, his lowest approval rating of either term.
I think it's been fascinating to watch the split screen of, on the one hand, these fairly negative polling numbers for the president on the economy, on immigration, on the war in Iran, and yet a point where President Trump has felt really emboldened.
They think Cuba could be a win at a time when things are kind of in a somewhat of a stalemate with Iran.
Hi, guys. Here we are another week. The president has, of course, been so focused on foreign affairs for the last few weeks and months with everything that's been going on in the world, his trip to China. But he is back in the US this past week and firmly focused, I think, on home affairs. We had those few pretty spicy primary elections. He's been updating us on the progress of the ballroom refurbishment. But also bubbling away this week has been the issue of Cuba, so close to the US, of course.
The Cuba issue is interesting because it's international, but at the same time, it's hugely important for him domestically. The Cuban American population in South Florida was a big part in his victory in 2024. I think nearly 70% of them voted in his favor, and that's something I think he kept in mind when he took this foreign policy decision.
Yeah, the indicting of Raul Castro, of course, it was just remarkable to see the press conference around that Department of Justice announcement with these long, extended applauses by those who were gathered in the audience. And it really was a sense of, and Bernie, I remember when you were down in Miami speaking to Venezuelan Americans after Nicolas Maduro was seized. Well, this is, take that to another level with the deep roots of the Cuban American community and the exile community, particularly in South Florida. This was one where, they have long been wanting to see the U.S. take a much more muscular posture. And you do get the sense that, as you were saying, Katrina, as President Trump has come home from China, and of course, you have the Iran war bubbling away, or we understand negotiations bubbling away in the background, that he's now really also shifting his focus to Cuba.
Yeah, and just I suppose to explain in case anyone missed that the US Department of Justice bringing charges against the former president Raul Castro, brother, of course, of the very famous Fidel Castro. And it's in connection to an incident 30 years ago, which brought up a lot of questions as to sort of why now. And the timing of this announcement coming, Independence Day for Cuba, 30 years later, at a time when the US has really been squeezing Cuba, hasn't it, in the last few weeks with extra sanctions, with an oil blockade, really making life very, very difficult for the Cuban people. Let's be honest, very difficult situation for them, but really trying to put pressure on the current administration there.
Of course, we saw the head of the CIA fly to Havana to meet with Cuban officials, which I think is, for a very long portion of modern Cuban history, that's almost unthinkable for the head of the CIA, an agency that spent decades trying to unseat Fidel Castro and then Raul Castro. The imagery of that just suggested to many people in Miami that after many decades, there's finally movement with regards to Cuba and actually potentially making some changes there, whether those be political or economic. We can't quite say just yet, but I think there's a lot of fanfare for that among Cuban Americans in the US.
Yeah, interesting to point out, of course, that when the Secretary of State Marco Rubio himself, a Cuban American, he delivered a direct message, a 5-minute video in Spanish to the Cuban people, as he said, on their Independence Day. Interesting to see that when he was asked about what is the U.S. doing, is this nation building, is it regime change, he comes back to that national security point where he says this is a country, an island country, 90 miles off the coast of the U.S., and it is a place where you have the U.S.'s adversaries, China and Russia, with their own presence, their own foothold on Cuba, and we can't have that. That is how he's been framing it, and of course, that's something that we know Marco Rubio has been quite hawkish on for quite a long time. But I think the outstanding question is, what is it exactly that the U.S. wants? That's something that, in my eyes, has not been answered. And from what we understand in the reporting is, well, the Cubans want to know as well, what type of agreement does President Trump want to see made? Does he want the same type of agreement he has with Venezuela, with their leader now, Delcy Rodriguez, or, does he want something further? And that's not entirely clear. And it could be that that's what the CIA director was in part talking about when he was there on his visit. But, what are the calculations that President Trump is making here?
I think that's a really good point because what agreement are you going to get with the leadership in Cuba who have a very sort of set view of the US? They're not going to want the type of regime, perhaps you might call it, that the US wants installed in Cuba. That's just not going to happen. So it's an interesting point when Marco Rubio keeps coming back to it's about national security. We can't have a failed state run by friends of our adversaries there. And then he's talking about we want to give some humanitarian aid. We want it given out by the Catholic Church and one or two humanitarian organizations that the US trusts, he says, working in the US. What is in it for the Cuban people? I mean, listening to some people in South Florida, and Bern, you might know perhaps better about this, there seems to be some sort of expectation that the protests we're seeing in Cuba recently are going to somehow lead to an uprising and an overthrowing from within Cuba. And that is the point at which the US would come to some kind of assistance there, notwithstanding all their talk about wanting a negotiated diplomatic solution, which even Marco Rubio said is highly unlikely.
I think in the long term, that's kind of poses a challenge for the Trump administration. So if they do kind of see a Venezuela situation in which a Delcy Rodriguez-like figure emerges in Cuba, but the infrastructure of the Cuban state remains intact, even if they're more kind of pliant to U.S. interests, that doesn't satisfy the demands of many Cuban American lawmakers, of Cuba hawks on Capitol Hill, of many people in South Florida and in other Cuban communities in the United States. We saw something quite similar. There's many Venezuelans that were very happy to see Nicolas Maduro go. They're not very happy that Delcy Rodriguez and kind of the infrastructure of the Venezuelan state's intact. And I think that's something that President Trump and Marco Rubio will get more and more questions about, because I think, domestically, that's a much harder thing to justify. But also, I think that President Trump wants to avoid the sort of messy nation building exercise that he campaigned against. If the Cuban state were to collapse entirely, it would very much become that, with the added complication of potentially a massive outflux of Cubans to the United States or to other parts of the region.
That is the other big question I have here, is what exactly is President Trump planning to do at a time where most Americans don't think that he made the right choice in launching the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran, and with the war in Iran, that there needs to be more focus on the cost of living, on the cost of gas prices, which we've talked about so much on this pod, and on domestic issues, especially with midterm elections just around the corner. And you really see that reflected in polling. And, poll after poll in recent weeks have really not painted a very pretty picture for the president, particularly on the economy. And you wonder if we see some sort of shift towards looking at Cuba as another important, let's say, foreign policy operation for the Trump administration. What will that do to those already quite low ratings for the president?
I think you can't underestimate either the involvement of Marco Rubio here. I mean, it is personal for him. He is a Cuban American. He's the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. And he, many would say is actually sort of leading the administration policy on this one. You also have to look at some of those districts in Florida, which might be kind of tight, not in the 2028 presidential election, but in some of the congressional races that we're seeing. And if we're talking about such tiny margins in the House, is there an element there as well of, those voters you're talking about, Bernie, trying to do something that would persuade people who maybe otherwise not enthralled by what this administration has achieved for all the reasons you mentioned there, Sumi, about the economic matters? Is there a sort of a win or an offer that can be provided? But I keep coming back to the timing of this. I mean, why now? If there isn't a deal in place, and based on what Marco Rubio is saying, it doesn't look like one is even close. What is the game here for this specific time when the US is already so militarily involved in Iran, of course, and, is stretched there in terms of where the military operation is? What happens what happens next?
I think that's kind of part of the benefit for the Trump administration to focus on Cuba a bit, because they think Cuba could be a win at a time when things are kind of in a somewhat of a stalemate with Iran, and they see it as something that it's a foreign policy win that Americans are generally much more familiar with than the war in Iran. And also, if the US media and Americans are speaking about Cuba, they're not speaking about those elevated petrol prices. I mean, there's only on air, for example, if everyone's talking about Raul Castro, they're not talking about prices. And I think to a certain extent, the administration sees that as a benefit. President Trump's a master of kind of moving the story away from whatever he doesn't want it to be.
I think one of the issues that the administration will face with that is that, there are going to be plenty of Republican lawmakers who are going to be begging them to come back to some of the issues that will matter for them in the upcoming midterms. And I've just been looking at, again, the polling that I was just mentioning. The big poll that a lot of people have been looking at in this past week is the New York Times Siena poll that showed that President Trump's approval rating was 37%. So 59% of people who were polled, so these are US adults who were polled, disapprove of his job as president. And on the economy, only 33% approve of the job that he's doing, 64% disapproving. And we've been talking about these numbers in recent weeks of how they've been kind of ticking downwards. And these are pretty alarming numbers. There are some positive signs for Republicans if you look at when you break that down by party. And of course, if you look at Republican voters, they still largely approve of the job that President Trump is doing and also of the decision to enter the war with Iran. But again, if we're throwing Cuba into the mix, does that change that polling even more? And does that drag on Republicans' brand ahead of the midterms even more?
And another poll out this week. There were many polls out this week. It was a week of polls and primaries in many ways, but was the Quinnipiac poll, which had an even worse approval rating for President Trump. 33% only of the people they polled approving of what he's done so far. His lowest approval rating of either term. And when it came to the sort of economic issues around that, 68% of those polled felt that the president wasn't focused enough on addressing the issues that Americans really care about. And again, drilling down into that, the issues the Americans really care about, they told the pollsters, the economy, number one, top, as always it is on these lists. So again, you line up Cuba, you line up Iran alongside all of that. And those remarks that we were talking about last week as President Trump was flying to China saying, I'm not thinking about, Americans' financial problems. I mean, he did go on to say, I'm thinking about the national security in terms of Iran not having a nuclear weapon. But still, the first part of that sentence has been jumped on. It's still floating around this week. And I think when we see that bearing out in polls as well, that people just feel that President Trump is moving further away from them in terms of what they care about. Gas prices still on the way up. But again, going back to that Quinnipiac poll, there was a really high majority of people noticing that their gas prices are going up and feeling the pinch in their pockets. And when you're into the place in polling where people are noticing the impact, not just on the signs as they drive by the forecourt of the garage, but actually in their pocketbooks, in their wallets, then you're in trouble.
I think it's interesting because the White House, because of the primaries against Thomas Massie, for example, they're kind of seen this week as one of wins politically. But what they haven't acknowledged is that the primaries are a very kind of narrow set of Republican voters. And I think the more alarming for them is kind of the large swing voting communities across the United States who could be swayed by those high petrol prices, especially if they feel it themselves. I've spoken to a few people in this last week that were Trump voters in the last election, but because of these price issues, specifically petrol, they're kind of changing their mind. And I think that's a trend that will cause a lot of alarm in the Republican Party, even if President Trump still clearly has kind of a very firm grip on the MAGA base.
I think it's been fascinating to watch the split screen of, on the one hand, these fairly negative polling numbers for the president on the economy, on immigration, on the war in Iran. And yet, a point where President Trump has felt really emboldened. I mean, look at these primary races that we're talking about, where President Trump and his MAGA team have won. Indiana, where they were able to defeat 5 out of 7 of those state legislators who had decided not to go with the president on redistricting, so redrawing congressional lines in their state. You had Senator Bill Cassidy in Louisiana, who in 2021 had voted in favor of impeaching President Trump. And that revenge came right around now, where he lost his primary in Louisiana. And then Thomas Massie, of course, the most expensive House primary race, where this was the most public battle between President Trump and the congressman losing this one. And there's another big test next week in Texas, where you have the Senate Republican primary runoff between John Cornyn, who's the incumbent, a longtime senator, and who President Trump endorsed, who's the Attorney General Ken Paxton, who was kind of a full-throated MAGA candidate. And I think, Texas in a way is particularly interesting because you saw a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill concerned and upset about the fact that President Trump endorsed not the incumbent, not the man who's sitting in the Senate right now, John Cornyn, but his opponent. But that in a way also shows how President Trump feels right now. He's looking at these victories across the board and saying, I am at the zenith of my power in the Republican Party, and I can take those risks. I'm able to, whether he sees it as a risk or not, I can make those decisions because this is my party. And clearly the voting in these primaries shows that.
I wonder about the strategy here because, Bernie, as you said, these are primary elections. It's only the really super card carrying members of both parties who really kind of go and get involved in primary elections. And the administration, the president celebrating the wins of the MAGA candidates and the candidates that he's backed. I wonder if he's thinking ahead to a situation where there are potentially uncomfortable votes in the next Congress, and he wants the Republicans who are there to not vote against him. And what is the best way of securing that outcome for himself next year is to make sure that the Republicans who are in seats are loyal to him, that they are not the ones who might be persuaded to side with the Democrats on some issues, but who will remember that he backed them and he helped them to get elected, and that he's expecting a trade in loyalty in return because, obviously the margin is so thin in the House right now. I don't think anyone's expecting, even with all the redistricting, that there'll be some huge Republican majority next year. And there may not be a huge Democratic majority either, even though some Democrats are very hopeful of that. So, when you see all of this money going into races like of people competing against themselves, basically, right? They're not competing against their opponent. They're not competing for security or power in the House. It's like, what is the long game here when you're putting so much money and effort into an internal battle, not a battle that's about keeping power for your whole party, but about keeping power for yourself?
I think that's a huge takeaway for Trump and a very big part of the lessons learned, for the Republican Party. I mean, in some ways, this was very much a revenge tour in which he took aim at people who kind of broke with what he wanted. I mean, I think Thomas Massie is obviously the best example, who criticized how he handled the Epstein files. He's been critical of him for quite some time now. I think other lawmakers will see that and take away the lesson that, if one crosses President Trump will then come back even, towards the tail end of his presidency, ahead of the next election, and he still has an enormous impact. And that doesn't end in the next year. That doesn't end in 2 years. He's someone who remembers things for a very long time. He's very happy to tell reporters that he kind of holds grudges for quite some time. And I think a lot of lawmakers will be kind of cognizant of that and think about that before they speak out against any particular policy.
President Trump has, in the meantime, created a small caucus, perhaps inadvertently, in Congress that no longer feels it has to be completely loyal to him. So think about Senator Bill Cassidy, Senator Tom Tillis, who's retiring, now Congressman Thomas Massie. And that means that they can actually put their foot down until they're out of office, which is not until January of next year, on some of the president's initiatives. President Trump has been out in social media warning Republicans, saying you better get in line or you will be out of a job. But for those who are going to be out of a job anyways, that doesn't matter so much, of course. On the other hand, I think what Democrats have to see as a warning here is President Trump and his aligned super PACs can pour so much money into races, and that could make some of those seats where Democrats are feeling pretty comfortable and safe all the more difficult.
Just this week, we heard him threaten Lauren Boebert, who is super loyal to the president,
Yeah.
except he would see it regarding the issue around the Epstein files. She's been one of the most vocal people about publicizing those. And she even posted on her social media on Tuesday night, Trump is my president, lest there be any ambiguity there. And we've also seen him threaten Brian Fitzpatrick, the quite moderate Republican in Pennsylvania as well. So it's interesting that he's kind of keeping everyone on their toes like that. And how will we see that play out in the months ahead of the midterm elections, the last few months of this Congress, when, as we say, the margins are so tight as they are? Who knows?
And I think it'll be fascinating to see what people like Thomas Massie do. I mean, how far they push it. I mean, Massie, for example, has already been on the podcast circuit. And I think it's not outside the realm of possibility that he'll be extremely outspoken, even more so than now. And at that point, it's not just that he's speaking to Republicans or the MAGA base. He's speaking to everyone, and people want to hear what he has to say about President Trump. I think in the longer term, that's a challenge. And about the Democrats, I also think it's interesting because I think in some cases, Ken Paxton in Texas, for example, they would almost rather face a Trump-aligned candidate than kind of a moderate Republican that they think can kind of cross aisles and speak to those sort of kind of middle of the road voters. I think, at least in some cases, they see it as the preferred option because they can point to an association with President Trump, and they think that will be kind of a successful tactic.
That's been the warning from Republicans on Capitol Hill who say if you put in a more extreme MAGA candidate, some of those more moderate Republican voters might go to the Democrat. And in Texas, that's what they're concerned will actually happen there. But at the same time, again, that money and spending spree and kind of the negative ads that will be ramping up. We're already seeing that against the Democrat there, James Tallarico, who's been called a vegan by President Trump because he ordered a potato, cheese, and egg taco, which apparently is not an authentic taco. Which I should say, by the way, is not vegan anyways, but regardless, that's neither here nor there. They will obviously be ramping up their attacks on him as well. And that might be effective in being able to paint him as a liberal, woke, progressive, left-wing Democrat. And I think that is going to be the real and probably fairly nasty battle that we see heading towards the midterms. And even if President Trump has more MAGA candidates put in place to run in several of these really important seats, I think he and his team feel quite confident that they'll be able to win those seats.
Now, Texas will be a hot race in more ways than one. But, with any of these, whether the Democrat is facing a super MAGA candidate or not, it depends on the Democratic candidate, doesn't it? I mean, we're seeing
Totally.
quite a variance in terms of, types of candidates and backgrounds and interests in some of these really tight races as well. And it's going to come down, as it always does in midterm elections, who's better at getting out the vote? What is the apparatus like? They're midterm elections. They're notoriously hard to get people sort of interested in and motivated by. And it's going to be about money, as American politics are, which is always bamboozling to those of us not from America, how much cash, how many millions are spent on races. It's going to come down to that, and it's going to come down to party organisation. But it will be a fascinating one to watch. And spoiler alert, we will be talking about this a lot for the next few months. But I think we're out of time for today talking about this, although we could go for many hours more.
Yep. Well, we'll talk about it again, I'm sure, next week. Great to see you guys.
Bye.
Hi, guys.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then do like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.